Hey everyone, which of DBD's killers are actually balanced? I want to take a look at all the killers today and judge whether they are balanced or not and place them into this list. I also want to consider what could be done for them if they aren't. Let's get into it. Trapper. Trapper is a tough case as a character who by his very existence is sort of meant to be weak as the first character you unlock in the game. However, I do believe despite this he isn't balanced. To quickly define balance, I think that a character is balanced when they're fair, simply. This doesn't necessarily mean they can't be strong or weak, it just means every action they do deserves a fair counter, and equally every counter deserves a fair answer. Balance in quite a literal sense, I guess. With this in mind, Trapper gets kind of rolled in most situations, although I do think it's largely down to the pace of the game being a lot faster nowadays, and also maps in general being much more varied, with some being more punishing than others. Trapper is always struggling to keep up with everyone, essentially. I think an honestly fair change to him would be to fix this by making all of his traps start the game set or opened, and possibly even spawn in areas where they may actually trap people, like in main buildings, within loops, and so on. This would notably buff Trapper, but not make him unstoppable, whilst also making him even more new player friendly. The core kit isn't really his problem after all, I think, it's just the setup, and so doing this would sort of fix that in my opinion. It's then the Trapper's responsibility to pick up and move the traps as he sees fit, and reset them once disarmed. Wraith. Wraith is our first case, I'd say, of a pretty balanced character, with him not necessarily being the strongest either, but him being fair regardless, with his ability being simple yet counterable, but equally having certain tricks that do give him the advantage, like body blocking windows. He's fair. Billy I would say on the whole is also very balanced, with maybe the only thing not making him so being the poor collision of some maps, and some maps being slightly too punishing for him, like RPD, so honing in all the map hitboxes would be nice in his case, I guess. Nurse is maybe the most egregious case over the years of being too strong or overtuned and having a complete lack of balance, with her being the antithesis of it, able to deny and ignore all of the resources of any given map. Therefore she could use a whole overhaul to her powers, as I think it simply isn't really salvageable if you want it to actually be fair. An idea I've always liked is keeping her core power intact but making it earnable instead of always present. I had an idea where, similar to old Freddy, she's able to suck the breaths out of survivors, each survivor offering a breath for each health state they have. Consuming a breath gives you a blink, but after using it, you return to being a regular move speed 4.6 killer. This way she does keep her core power, but it's a lot more balanced, I'd say, and you actually have to sort of earn it and do something to gain it. Myers. After his rework, Myers has certainly been a bit of a hot topic of debate, with him sometimes being considered difficult to counter by many, mainly once he's powered up with Evil Within, due to him being able to dash around entire loops once charged. I think a fair change in this case would be to remove the pallet break he's currently able to do when powered up, as I think even with that gone, he's still very capable. Maybe as an alternative, his break speed could be increased even further from 1.2 to 1.4 to even this out. Hag was largely viewed as undertuned, and I'd even make the argument she's actually greatly undertuned currently, with her being incredibly easy to counter. This is partly down to the maps and pace of the game again, similar to Trapper, which makes it hard to set up an area without losing out on a ton of early game pressure. Hag can also be easily countered as her traps can be scratched out. She really doesn't have much going for her at all. I think, honestly, to keep her in line with the pace of the game, her traps need to replenish themselves after maybe a minute of being deactivated. They simply need to reactivate themselves, allowing them to be triggered again. This and some kind of counter to somewhat punish a survivor scratching a trap. Maybe once they scratch the trap, they get inflicted with a status like Oblivious, say, for 30 seconds. These two things alone would make such a huge difference, I think, along with quite a substantial add-on overhaul as well. She definitely needs one. Doctor was somewhat contested as being balanced. Personally, I'd say he is, but all of you voted for him being slightly undertuned. I think the main reason for this is probably the ease of countering him in chase, with there being a pallet abundance nowadays. It's easy to simply pre-drop and press W against him. Therefore my idea for Doctor is to give him some anti-pallet abilities, at base. When using his static blast attack, any dropped pallets within his terror radius are shattered by the static blast, allowing him to clear out whole loops in and out of chase. I think that would help a lot. Bubba is another case of being pretty balanced nowadays, honestly. The main change I'd make to him, similar to Billy, is just the collision of certain things can be inconsistent, but that's more of a map issue. With the presence of anti-camp, I think Bubba is honestly fine nowadays, although all of you did say undertuned for the most part. I think this is down to Bubba's lack of map control or any form of speed. I do have a cool but maybe slightly out of pocket idea, but I do think it falls in line with Texas Chainsaw, so it works. This would be to give Bubba a stealth and traversal ability. Once activated, Bubba Bubba turns off his chainsaw, but is able to move at 5.2 meters per second, the same speed as a running Legion. During this time, he's undetectable. To damage once again, he must first rev up the chainsaw with a 5-second animation, alerting those nearby but letting him get much closer than he would have been able to. I think that could be quite cool, and could maybe solve the map traversal issue, and maybe even make him kind of a jump scare character, which could be fun. Huntress has always been a very fair character, with her hatchets being plenty counterable around high wall loops or just long ones, yet her equally having areas of greater power out in the open or on low walls. She's pretty consistent and has always been able to perform solidly. Freddy is another character who's just pretty balanced, honestly, especially after all his reworks. I think he's done getting reworked now and he's just fine. Almost all of you agree with that as well, so yeah, let's leave him alone. Pig has famously throughout the years been viewed as very weak, but I do think nowadays she's more and more close to balance. The core thing holding her back is that, well, she's a stealth killer primarily. All stealth killers are weak nowadays with the game's fast pace, Pig being unique in that she also has reverse bear traps which can often turn the tables. These two though are largely inconsistent and RNG reliant. I want to suggest a pretty wild change maybe. All survivors now start the trial with reverse bear traps that cannot be removed. Each time a generator is completed, the traps activate, and survivors must seek out a box to deactivate them. However, it will only take one attempt to deactivate. The traps have an overall timer of 2 minutes which is shared between all of the activations. Only after the final generator is completed can the traps be removed permanently. I think this could possibly be too strong, maybe, but could also maybe fix all of her problems as well, and allow her to focus more so on her stealth and gameplay. Clown was actually largely voted as balanced, with a few votes which could suggest him being slightly overtuned. I think this is down to his lack of wider map control, as he only really has pressure in a one-on-one chase. Or it could just be that his one-on-one chase feels too oppressive. In some ways, I think this kind of makes him balanced. Whilst his one-on-one is strong, he lacks elsewhere, leaving him decently fair. Spirit has gone through quite a lot of changes and is a lot more balanced nowadays, but I do think somewhat overtuned still, considering her counterplay is still largely focused on listening to the acute static noise when she's phasing, or keeping an eye out for small grass movements. It's hard of course, as by its nature her power is sort of overpowered as she goes invisible. I want to suggest a small change that could also make her more accessible for those with hearing issues too. This is to add a similar mechanic to Chucky's footfalls when she's phasing. When she phases, the footfalls appear in the path behind where she's moved, about a second after. This for one shows she's phasing, but also gives you a vague indicator of the direction she's coming from, yet still gives her plenty of potential for mind games, as she can fake going one way and then go the other, and she has the general advantage still as she's a whole second ahead, which is a lot when she phases. Legion, maybe one of the most hotly contested characters balance-wise. Some say they're too counterable, others too uncounterable. Ultimately, I think both are kind of right. Legion could reasonably be placed in lacking counters, but also too easy to counter, as it largely depends on how coordinated the team is when facing them. It really ultimately depends on if teams spread out or not. Therefore, the fix to their balance is to make them less reliant on this, I'd say. I think a simple buff would be to make it so when in frenzy, Legion sees survivors with killer instinct from any range. This allows them to gain information even if a team is spread, yet still stops them from hitting everyone most of the time, but gives them that possibility if they're efficient. So I think that could work out. A sort of best of both worlds. Plague is honestly probably one of the most balanced characters in terms of her cause and effect and general fairness. It's quite literally a power where you're appropriately punished for cleansing as a survivor, but equally this can be a positive sometimes too if done in a coordinated way. I think reasonably it's one of the best designed powers in the game for this fair cause and effect it has. Ghosty is interesting as one of the weakest killers in the game. I think he is too weak as well, and far from being balanced in his current state, with him lacking any pressure in the majority of his matches. It's hard though, as his whole power revolves around him being slow and watching people. Maybe Ghosty needs some kind of map control, like a camera system. This would sort of work with his lore too. Perhaps he can set up CCTV cameras, and can stalk through them if he pleases, monitoring them by pulling out his cell phone. This may seem quite extreme, but I think his core power currently is just basically not enough, and he'll always be weak if he stays with just that, so he needs like some kind of actual gameplay additional ability or benefit. Demogorgon. I think Demo is a pretty perfect case of being balanced with all of its abilities, yet also being quite a weak character, which is fine I think. Shred is fair and is perfectly counterable, and the portals, same goes. Everything has an answer, but none of these answers are necessarily OP counters either. Oni I'd also say is very balanced, although he does have frustrating aspects for each side. To play as, it can be annoying to have survivors constantly pre-drop in the early game, but then equally it can be hard to counter him in the late game if he's constantly able to insta-down you. I think it balances out honestly, with only a few maps like the game making Oni truly unbalanced. Deathslinger I'd also place into balanced, although his power is largely reliant on how effective the user is with it, which is sort of a rarer ability when it comes to killers, but one that does make it easier to balance I think because most of the weight just falls to player skill or knowledge. For this reason I think he's fine honestly, but it can be a bit tough for him on some bigger maps for sure. I'd say that's more of just a map issue though, to be fair. Pyramid Head, wow, perfect streak. I'd also say he's just pretty balanced, especially with his add-on rework. Now he's honestly just in a really solid spot and is pretty fair. He is a tough one to balance I think with his overloaded kit, but in his current state I think it ends up being fair due to the challenge that comes with it. Blight. After Blight's changes in patch 9.6.0, reducing his movement down to 4.4, and also forcing him to lose tokens after breaking a pallet, it makes him balanced in my opinion. He's undoubtedly still strong, but I think now he's perfectly counterable, and the skill required to both play and face him is fair, I'd say. Twins. Interestingly, Twins was voted as balanced, overtuned and undertuned, all fairly evenly, so what do we make of that? I think honestly we make that no one really knows much about Twins because they're so rare. I think as well that Twins, unlike some other killers who need to be fixed in some way, people just need to learn to play Twins in a not annoying way, as this is where most of the hate for their gameplay comes from. Twins themselves are strong characters and are balanced mostly fine I'd say, but the lack of knowledge surrounding them often leads to them being either over or underestimated I think. So I think they could safely be left the same. Trickster was sort of helped out a bit during his rework where he became buffed up by his various different ranks. However, he still struggles a lot on larger maps especially, and ones which have a lot of high walls, like his own map. The best fix for this I think is to just buff his speed back up to 4.6, but potentially also provide him with easier location of his lockers by highlighting them whenever he is below, say, half his total blades. Ultimately, he's mostly fine though. Nemesis. Nemi I'm putting into slightly undertuned, but just because of his zombies, as everything else I think is fine. Fix the zombies and their large uselessness, and we'd be golden. Maybe make them commandable to some level, or have them just patrol set areas. Pinhead was considered balanced by many, but slightly undertuned as well. I get this too, as it can often feel like an uphill battle with Pinhead, who relies so much on his ability to hit the chain shots, which are difficult, yet not really that rewarding. A good fix for him I'd say then is to provide a more rewarding outcome for landing a chain shot, especially at range. It could be something as simple as an extra chain, or maybe even different numbers of chains based on the distance you landed the hit from. So for example, if it's a meter or two away you get 1 chain, but if it's a whole 20 plus meters, or something like that, you get like 6 chains, allowing you to actually potentially reach the survivor or at the very least gain notable ground. That could honestly solve this I think, and it would feel rewarding. Artist was also considered very balanced, and I'd have to agree. My only gripe with her is that she's way too easy to counter at range with lockers. I think the locker counterplay should be straight up removed, as it disrupts one of her most interesting playstyles of going for long shots. Sadako was very comfortably placed in greatly undertuned, and yeah, I get it. She basically has one playstyle, and the success of the playstyle is entirely reliant on how capable or aware the players are at returning the tapes, which isn't really hard at all. Sadako is a mess honestly, and I think needs a complete power revision. I think small fixes that could help though would be to buff her other areas, so she focuses less on Condemned, as it's annoying and also largely unfair and boring gameplay. So make her stealthier with less of the static noises, buff her in some way for utilizing her teleports, and aim to give Condemned more of a secondary focus. A bit like Pig's reverse bear traps, where they're present but they aren't likely to be deadly. I don't really know what to suggest with Sadako honestly though. She seems like a bit of a mess, and it seems beyond my capabilities, or I don't know. I think she needs like a literal entire power revision. The whole thing needs changing. Dredge I would say is definitely undertuned, although has been getting better all the time, with the small changes and buffs here and there. I think a notable one to do would be a clear pass on all maps, assessing locker placement, and filling in the areas where they rarely spawn. There's still a handful of maps that just largely have empty corners. This and an add-on rework would do wonders, and maybe a handful of smaller number adjustments too. Wesker is probably one of the most agreed upon fair but decently strong killers in the game. He offers a strong ability to dash and hunt down survivors, yet these dashes are fairly rigid and are perfectly counterable with a dodge. There's plenty of loops he's amazing at and others he's really bad at, so yeah, he's a solid example of balance, I'd say. Knight is another, honestly, I'd say, is decently balanced nowadays. Bear in mind, annoying doesn't mean he lacks balance. The guards and the pincer ring and such can be frustrating, but that doesn't mean he isn't balanced, I would say. Skull Merchant on the other hand is still very undertuned, and yet I sort of disagree with the vote, as I think she kind of is balanced in a weird way. Logically she's not, but in practice she's often quite good because survivors tend to not really know what the drones even do. However, I realise this is not really a good argument in the long run, but a bit like Sadako, I'm not too sure what to suggest for Merchant. I think she's a case of being a bit too far gone due to the overwhelming hatred for the character. Let the people who enjoy her, as everyone else is probably going to stay fairly stuck in their view toward her, unfortunately. Singularity. Hux has been overtuned, I'd say, over the past few years, with his difficulty lowering and him becoming a lot more straightforward. I think he could be fixed with a relatively simple change, as his main issue is how oppressive he is when he's in overclock mode. He shreds pallets a little too quickly and can be very oppressive with constant teleports. Lowering his overclock break speed down to 50% instead of 75 would help, and potentially even adding on a cooldown onto his teleport, stopping him from being able to spam it. I also think reverting the EMPs to charge fully would be fine as well at this point. There's only 4 of them in the map anyway, so I think it's not a big deal. Xenomorph. Xenos actually had some really solid changes in 2025 that led to it just being pretty fair, honestly. I personally still don't like the tail attack and how it isn't visually flagged very well, but that's like super petty of me. Xeno is largely fine. Chucky I'd also say is largely fine. He's a character with a solid dash and stealth ability, and I'd maybe say a few add-on reworks could do him some good, but that's about it. He's fine overall and has fair gameplay, with each ability having its ups and downsides. Or ability, I guess. He just kind of has one, really, doesn't he? Unknown. Ooh, well, here's a character that's most definitely undertuned and has even garnered the name The Harmless in the process due to being so underpowered. I think I would agree with this too. Unknown is a tricky character yet gets very little in the way of relief for any mistakes. The first thing I'd absolutely do is buff the time taken to break out of Weakened, as currently it feels so quick and can be done so easily mid-chase. I think it could use another 5 seconds at least staring at Unknown to break out of Weakened. Then I'd also want to add a mechanic where Weakened goes back up if you don't see Unknown for long enough, allowing it to remain for a greater duration. The other thing I'd want to add would be a larger blast zone for the UVX, allowing for easier hits through walls, but also just hits in general to encourage UVX usage. Vecna I'd say is largely balanced as a killer with a multitude of abilities, yet a bunch of counters too, and a whole array of magical items which literally provide you with varying ways to buff yourself against them. He's a great example of balance as well. Dracula was voted as overtuned. I'd agree he's a little busted every now and then. I do however think most of his abilities and the situations you find yourself in when facing him are relatively counterable though. Each of his forms too I'd say are fair. It's more so the combination of the 3 together that makes him strong, which does make it hard to adjust him. So potentially something as simple as a longer switching period or longer switch charge time so he can't change forms so rapidly could maybe help him out. Houndmaster to me is very balanced, with her having a strong ability in Snug, yet it being very well signposted with you being able to literally see where Snug moves, allowing you to track what is essentially a dash. Aside her bugs, she's great. Kaneki was the only other character aside Nurse voted as greatly overtuned, and I have to say I don't think I quite agree. As strong as Kaneki is, I think he's relatively fair. The only thing I don't think is fair and could use a change is his first deep wound, or his first hit. I think a simple alternate fix would be for him to apply a different status like hemorrhage, but without damaging the survivor, with you only being able to damage with dash hits once you're powered up. And even then, I don't think they should apply Deep Wound. This would fix his greatest issue though, I think, and leave him still really strong, but far more fair. Springtrap is another very balanced killer, with maybe his only weak or just pointless aspect being his security doors, which just kind of feel irrelevant in gameplay. I think there needs to be something in particular that encourages survivors to traverse the security office, as currently it's basically pointless. Maybe even make it possible to control all the cameras from within the office or something, but at the risk of Springtrap possibly entering. That could be cool, I think. As in like without a battery and you can see all the screens at the same time, so you have full overview. Krasue. Krasue is just kind of dull, but she's mostly fine, a little bit overtuned still. I honestly think she'd be largely fixed if her headlong flight was changed. I think currently she's able to use it way too freely, and if it was instead usable and then went on cooldown, it would be a lot fairer. She could use a much larger rework though in my opinion, as she's largely quite hated and underplayed. Vecna, or Henry, is another character a lot like Slinger to be honest, where his strength is largely dependent on the player's skill level and knowledge. Their ability to predict survivor movement well is basically what the power is contingent on. Therefore I'm inclined to say it's actually quite balanced, as the work you put in is the effect you get out. Although this isn't the case admittedly, as sometimes it can just be hard to predict perfectly even with a lot of knowledge. But the core idea is that, I'd say. Alright, well that's gonna do it. I do hope you enjoyed, and let me know which killers you think are the most balanced down below. Thanks, and goodbye.